They mocked him in the base cafeteria, calling him just a contractor, never knowing he once survived an ambush no Marine should have walked away from. But when the lights suddenly died and the alarm stayed silent, the truth he uncovered began pulling the entire base into its shadow. 2 security guards appeared from nowhere, too calm, too prepared, ushering him toward a place he was never meant to return from. And in that red-lit corridor, he realized the hard drive he found wasn't evidence. It was bait meant for a man they thought would break. Then came the voice in the hidden video.
Never about the money, John.
The same cold tone behind the attack that killed his unit, speaking his name long before he arrived. Forced into the dark with enemies closing in, his only unexpected ally was a quiet maintenance worker who knew more about ghosts than the base ever admitted. And now, with the network reawakening and the past hunting him again, he must face the handler who turned war into a blueprint for betrayal. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Guardian Stories Ridge. The morning fog did not simply sit over the base. It moved like something alive, sliding in slow coils around the radar domes and concrete bunkers as if it were studying them. Out beyond the chain-link fence and razor wire, the Pacific was a dull sheet of pewter, waves folding over themselves with the patient rhythm of something ancient and unimpressed by human effort. On the seaward side of the installation, trucks idled, generators hummed, and a cluster of white satellite dishes pointed toward a sky no one could properly see. Into that gray, humming world walked a man carrying a clipboard that looked almost too small for his hands. Mason Cole was 35 and built like someone who had spent years carrying more weight than he was supposed to. His shoulders were broad beneath a pale blue safety technician shirt. His dark hair, cut short in a style that used to be regulation, had not quite grown out of its military shape. A light, rough stubble covered his jaw. Unintentional, the shadow of a man who had never cared much about grooming his theater. His skin held the faded tan of long days under harsh suns far from this wet northern coastline. But his eyes, gray-green, alert, were the part of him that never blended. They measured spaces, cataloged exits, tracked shadows. The badge clipped to his chest read, M. Cole, Safety Compliance Technician, in harmless black letters. The kind of job that placed him somewhere between invisible and forgettable on most bases, exactly where he wanted to be. He crossed the open yard with footsteps steady and unhurried. Every motion seemed casual, but beneath it, his body moved with the silent geometry of someone trained long before the civilian boots touched his feet. He noted camera angles and blind spots without looking at them. He registered the sound of generators, the hum of antennas, the subtle vibration of the ground beneath him. He reached the UAV control building and paused, wiping condensation off his clipboard. Behind the glass doors, the glow of screens flickered over operators guiding unmanned aircraft across distant seas. Before he could step forward, a voice echoed down the hall. A cluster of officers emerged from the corridor, voices bright with caffeine and the arrogance of people confident in their place in the hierarchy. At the center walked Colonel Blake Halloway, tall, sharply built, with steel-gray hair and a jaw set like he'd spent years clenching it around orders he was proud to give. Halloway wore his rank like armor. His pale blue eyes could have been kind, but he didn't let them. Today they were amused and just a shade cruel. "Well now," he said loudly, just enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't our savior of fire extinguishers." A few officers chuckled, some out of genuine amusement, others because laughter was part of the choreography around a man with silver eagles on his collar. A young lieutenant with 2 bright eyes and an eagerness to impress grinned as if he'd just been thrown a ball to chase. Mason adjusted the clipboard calmly. His hands were large, knuckles marked with pale scars from years of equipment, walls, and maybe fists. Beneath his sleeve, the faint ridge of an old shrapnel wound scraped against cotton. "Just here to review some emergency protocols, sir," Mason said softly. His voice held a mild Pacific Northwest drawl. "Won't get in anyone's way." Something flickered in Holloway's gaze. Annoyance, perhaps, at the lack of visible discomfort. But he masked it with a louder laugh. "Protocols," he repeated. "You hear that? While we're tracking incoming threats, he's checking exit signs. Sleep easy, everyone." Laughter erupted again. Mason allowed himself a small, ambiguous smile. Not submissive, not defiant, simply unreadable. "Fire doesn't care what you're tracking, sir," he said quietly. "It burns whatever's in front of it." A few officers stopped laughing before forcing themselves to restart. Holloway's eyes narrowed, analyzing him anew. "You prior service?" he asked. "Or did they teach you tough guy poetry in contractor school?" "Did some time in uniform," Mason replied. "Nothing worth mentioning." "Right," Holloway said, not believing him, but unwilling to dig further. "Stay in your lane, Mr. Cole. You want to wander with your checklist? Fine. But you don't touch anything with a classified stamp. And you don't breathe on my systems without permission." Mason nodded once. Understood. But inside, he filed the threat away. People who overplayed authority usually had something to hide. In a small concrete room 2 buildings away, a server rack blinked oddly. One red light pulsing offbeat like a heartbeat out of rhythm. At that exact moment, a forgotten hallway printer spat out a single sheet of paper. A maintenance memo no one had requested. At the bottom corner, someone had drawn a tiny, straight blue line. Too deliberate to be random. For anyone else, meaningless. For Mason Cole, when he discovered it later, it would feel like an old ghost clearing its throat. The group dispersed through the glass doors, badges swiping, locks sighing open. Their laughter faded, swallowed by the hum of servers. The hallway fell quiet again. At the far end, a maintenance cart squeaked as a young seaman pushed it, earbuds tucked carefully beneath his collar. Mason stepped aside, nodding. The kid nodded back with an automatic "sir" that didn't match Mason's badge, but matched the way Mason carried himself. "You didn't flinch," a voice remarked. Mason turned his head slightly. Leaning in the shadow of a comms closet alcove stood Sergeant Major Hank Doyle, a man built of wiry endurance and decades of habits. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with close-cropped white hair and a face lined by deployments and decisions that never stopped echoing. His eyes, dark, sharp, deeply set, didn't miss much. His rolled sleeves exposed sun-worn forearms marked with faint scars that had their own long histories. "Most contractors jump when a colonel barks," Hank said. "You just shifted your grip on that clipboard." Mason glanced down. It was true. The way he held the board wasn't civilian. It was instinct. How one holds equipment they can't afford to drop under pressure. "Guess I've been yelled at enough times," Mason replied lightly. "Gets dull after a while." Hank grunted. "You can't be more than mid-30s. 35. "Combat ages people," Hank murmured, watching him more closely now. For a moment, the hallway felt tight with things unsaid. Hank had seen this kind of man before. Men who carried invisible weight, men whose muscles still anticipated danger. "DC sent you then?" Hank asked. "Something like that," Mason said. Hank tapped the binder in his hand. "DC doesn't care about fire extinguishers. They care about leaks, things that embarrass them on the evening news. The clipboard creaked slightly in Mason's tightening grip before he loosened it. Hank stepped away, but paused. "Just a warning," he said. "Laugh louder next time the Colonel jokes or looks scared. Right now you look like you're evaluating him." "And that," Hank added, his voice low and knowing, "gets people curious. Curious can get dangerous." He walked off, boots echoing down the corridor. Mason stood alone again. Fog pressed against the narrow windows, turning daylight into a constant gray haze. The building vibrated faintly with life. Servers, networks, secrets. He lifted his clipboard. On top, fire code compliance checklist. Underneath, a page of access logs he'd been tracking since arrival. Times, usernames, anomalies. Someone here was moving data they shouldn't. Someone was selling pieces of the shield meant to protect them all. Mason Cole breathed once, slow, measured. A ghost among the living. And in this fog-bound coastal base, ghosts could walk places the living weren't invited. The civilian mess didn't have the ceremony of the officers' dining room. It was a long, echoing space with metal-framed chairs. Laminate tables scarred by years of trays and elbows. And a coffee station in the corner that looked like it had been assembled from government surplus and stubbornness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything a shade too harsh, a shade too real. The air smelled of burnt coffee, reheated eggs, and fryer oil that had seen better days. Mason Cole sat alone at a small table pushed near the far wall, a lukewarm sandwich on the tray in front of him. The bread had gone soft at the edges. The lettuce had given up days ago. But he chewed anyway, each bite measured and calm. He had chosen this corner deliberately. Back to the wall, line of sight to both exits, and a clean view of the room reflected in the metal food warmers. His posture looked relaxed to anyone else, but his eyes moved constantly, quietly mapping power structures, habits, and access levels. From the center of the room came a burst of laughter, rolling outward like a thrown pebble making ripples. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer was telling a story. Mercer looked like a recruitment poster, late 20s, athletic, lean but wiry. His light brown hair was clipped in a tight regulation fade, his jaw clean-shaven, almost too perfectly. His blue eyes were bright with the hunger of a young officer wanting the room to see him, recognize him, approve of him. He mimed holding a clipboard, hunching over dramatically. "I'm telling you," he said, loud enough to pull attention from 3 tables away. He stood there like OSHA sent their top agent to critique the apocalypse. "Fire burns whatever it touches, sir." The table erupted into laughter. A petty officer almost inhaled a French fry. Someone else slapped the table as if the joke might escape without applause. Mercer leaned back, boots wide, soaking in the approval that fed him more than the food ever could. Mason took another quiet bite. He heard everything, but none of it reached deep enough to matter. Instead, he inhaled. 1, 2, 3, 4. Held. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhaled. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Box breathing. The old battlefield rhythm. Even here, under fluorescent lights, it kept him centered. He watched without looking directly. Badge colors, seating patterns, who deferred to whom, who stayed silent, who laughed too loudly, who checked their phones every few minutes, as if waiting for orders whispered through a hidden channel. Near the service line, a logistics officer, tall, broad-shouldered, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, spoke in hushed frustration into her phone. Mason noted her badge stripe. Green and silver, mid-level access. By the windows sat a contractor in a white shirt, thin, nervous, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Two sailors wearing night shift fatigue slumped over their plates with the exhaustion of people held together by caffeine and duty. Every detail mattered, even the ones that didn't. Someone dropped a metal tray. A loud clang split the air. And for a heartbeat, Mason wasn't in the mess hall anymore. He was in a desert tent, canvas walls shaking with heat and distant thunder. He heard laughter, then a sharp, metallic crack. The sound that had ended half his squad. He blinked. The peas scattered across the mess hall floor rolled against a chair leg. He inhaled. 1, 2, 3, 4. The past folded itself away again, clean as a scar. At another table, Sergeant Major Hank Doyle ate soup and filled out forms. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh. He didn't react at all. He simply watched, eyes sharp, old, perceptive. He had spent more years in uniform than most of these officers had spent alive, and he knew when a man's silence meant something. Their eyes met for a brief second. He gave Mason a tiny nod. A veteran's acknowledgement, "I see you." Mason returned to his sandwich as if nothing had passed between them. Eventually, the lunch rush thinned. Mercer left with his orbit of eager young personnel still feeding off the afterglow of his performance. When the room quieted, Mason stood, cleared his tray, and left without hurry. The contractor housing area sat on the far edge of the installation, a line of rectangular buildings painted government beige, with peeling numbers and rattling HVAC units. Functional, temporary, forgettable. His room was narrow, metal-framed, fluorescent lit. The kind of space designed not for comfort, but for compliance. He locked the door. The persona of the mild-mannered technician fell away instantly. His shoulders straightened in a different way, less guarded, more prepared. He pulled a black laptop from the drawer. A series of authentication layers unfolded. Codes, passphrases, biometric confirmations, routing sequences. None of them appeared on any contractor protocol manual. The interface opened. Office of the Inspector General, Special Access Portal Case File. Coastal Defense Base, unauthorized data leak, active. 3 months of living as a ghost. 3 months pretending to care about fire extinguishers while mapping a betrayal buried deep inside the base. Mason scanned the logs again. Anomalous outbound data spikes, unauthorized remote logins, equipment requisitions aligning with suspicious timeline changes, all threads of a web. Now he had to find the spider. He opened another file. A grainy photograph appeared on screen. 12 Marines. Dusty, grinning, sunburned, alive. A younger Mason stood among them, helmet tilted back, eyes brighter, shoulders lighter. Next to him, a staff sergeant laughed mid-sentence, the kind of laugh that made the world feel survivable. That convoy should never have been ambushed. Someone had sold their route. The enemy had waited with impossible precision. The staff sergeant's body had been found 50 feet from the burning vehicle. Mason's left arm still bore the shrapnel scars. Someone in an air-conditioned office had called it an accident. Mason knew better, and someone in this base was repeating the same pattern. He closed the image, jaw tight, breath steady again. Not anger, not grief, a promise. He whispered to the empty room, "You're here. I'll find you." The 4-count breathing steadied him again as the cursor blinked on the investigation screen. Mason Cole was silent. But silence, when it belonged to a Marine like him, was never weakness. It was discipline. It was focus. It was the calm before justice. The base always felt different before sunrise. The night crew was still awake, the morning crew not yet present, and the few people drifting through the corridors moved like ghosts between metal walls that hummed with power and quiet authority. For Mason Cole, this twilight hour had always carried a peculiar comfort. Too many years in combat zones had trained him to trust transitions, the moments when one shift changed into the next, when people relaxed just long enough to reveal what they'd been hiding. He walked along the dim hallway, leading toward the fire suppression storage wing, clipboard tucked under his arm as usual. The overhead lights flickered slightly, delayed by the automated energy-saving system. His boots made almost no sound on the polished floor, but his senses stayed sharp. Every vent hum, every distant footstep, every electronic buzz threaded into his awareness like part of a living map. At the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged from the stairwell. A young woman, civilian clothes, dark skinny jeans, and a slate gray sweater, hair tied back in a tight braid. She moved with a careful, purposeful stride. Clutching a tablet to her chest, her badge swung from a lanyard. Elena Graves, Data Systems Contractor. Mason slowed instinctively. He had never seen her in this wing before. Elena Graves looked to be in her late 20s. Slim, pale complexion, sharp cheekbones that made her appear perpetually alert. Her dark brows pinched as if she carried constant worry. But her brown eyes held intelligence. Quick, calculating, flicking to each camera she passed as though she was silently scoring the angles. Not afraid. Aware. "Morning," Mason offered. She startled only slightly. Just a quick rise of her shoulders, nothing more. "Morning," she said in a soft but steady voice. "Didn't expect anyone down here yet?" Mason lifted his clipboard. Safety inspections don't wait for coffee. A small, nervous smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Right, of course." She shifted her tablet, hugging it closer. "I'm heading to the server alcove. System update queue crashed again." Her explanation was clean. Too clean. He nodded anyway. "Good luck with it." "You too," she murmured before disappearing into the next hallway. When she turned, Mason saw her fingers tremble just once before she steadied them. Something about her didn't fit. He kept moving. The fire suppression wing always smelled faintly of metal polish and pressurized foam. Rows of red cylinders lined the walls behind reinforced cages, each with a serial number and a small inspection tag. Mason scanned the first tag automatically, but his mind stayed on Elena's posture, the way she'd glanced at cameras, the guarded tension in her hands. 3 months on this base had taught him that people who wanted to remain unnoticed usually kept their eyes down. But Elena Graves had looked everywhere, like someone checking exits, like someone who didn't feel safe, or someone who had something to hide. He crouched to inspect a pressure gauge when a pair of boots stopped behind him. Sergeant Major Hank Doyle. "Didn't figure you for an early riser," Hank said, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. In the dim light, the creases around his eyes looked deeper, carved from decades of sand, salt, and regret. "I like the quiet," Mason replied. "That so?" Hank rubbed a thumb along his jawline, rough with gray stubble. "Quiet's when people hear the things they ignore during the day." Mason understood. Hank wasn't here for the cylinders. "You been watching me," Mason said. Hank blinked slowly. Old habits. Hard to shake 30 years of looking for the guy who doesn't match the furniture. "Do I not match the furniture?" "Son," Hank said with a low chuckle, "you don't even match the room." Mason didn't answer. Hank pushed himself upright with a faint grunt. "Careful walking around like that. Some people here, people above my pay grade, don't like questions that aren't theirs." Mason straightened. "Appreciate the warning." "Didn't say it was a warning." Hank tapped a knuckle on Mason's clipboard. "Might be a reminder. Furniture doesn't take notes." Then he walked away, his footsteps fading. Mason stared after him, The sergeant major was getting too close to the truth, but not close enough to be dangerous. Not yet. He continued down the hall and approached the cross corridor that led to the server alcove where Elena Graves had gone. The door was slightly ajar. A faint blue glow spilled into the hall. Mason hesitated, then stepped inside. Elena was kneeling beside a terminal cabinet, her tablet connected to a port by a short cable. The screen reflected in her lenses, lines of code scrolling fast, system commands executing with the fluidity of someone far more skilled than a contractor assigned to routine maintenance. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with the old, confident rhythm of someone who understood how to bypass safeguards rather than follow them. "Elena," Mason said softly. She jumped this time, really jumped, her tablet nearly slipping. "Oh, sorry," she breathed. "You startled me." "You're running deep-level diagnostics," he said. "That's not basic maintenance." Her expression froze. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation. A brief, razor-sharp moment of it. Then she forced a smile. "The Q corruption affects lower-level systems too. Hard to fix unless you dig this far." "Uh-huh," Mason said, unconvinced. She looked down again. "Do you need something?" "No," he said slowly. "Just checking that wing's clear." Their eyes held for a moment. She broke first. "I should finish this before the morning shift logs in." He nodded, stepped back, and left. But not far. He waited just outside the hall, listening. After 10 seconds, he heard her whisper, "Come on, come on." Her voice carried urgency, not professional frustration, genuine pressure. A few beats later, the typing stopped. Then the faint click of a USB drive being ejected. Mason's pulse ticked once. He had heard no USB insertion earlier. Elena Graves had plugged something in before he arrived, something she didn't want documented. As Mason turned to leave, he passed a narrow observation window overlooking the loading yard. Fog cloaked the ground like a low tide of smoke drifting between vehicles. And then, a silhouette. Someone stood perfectly still in the fog, motionless, almost absorbed by the gray. Tall, broad-shouldered, face obscured, watching the building, watching him. When Mason blinked, the figure dissolved back into the mist. But the impression lingered like a hand pressed briefly against his spine. He wasn't the only one hunting. By the time Mason reached the contractor housing again, the sky had brightened into a pale ribbon above the ocean. He entered his room and shut the door, breathing in the stillness. He powered up his encrypted laptop. 2 new anomalies had been logged overnight. Both traced back to the same subnet cluster Elena had accessed. Not proof, but enough to become a thread worth pulling. He brought up her personnel file, a standard base registry, basic employment details, contract dates, training background, nothing unusual. Which was the problem? Nothing about her file matched the way she moved. Someone had wiped her real history clean. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. His heartbeat stayed steady, but a cold recognition stirred beneath it. Whoever the mole was, they weren't working alone. And Elena Graves, nervous hands, quick eyes, mysterious USB drives, was either a pawn or another player. The fog outside thickened again, sliding against his window like a warning. 3 months in. The hunt was just beginning. The fog had thinned by the time Mason Cole stepped into the main operations corridor. But the morning brought a sharper bite to the air inside the building. It was the kind of cold that felt engineered, not from weather, but from metal walls, constantly running servers, and the subtle sterility of places built to hold secrets. Personnel were beginning to trickle in, sailors swapping night shift yawns for paperwork, junior officers clutching coffee cups like life rafts, engineers rolling tool carts that squeaked down the polished floors. Mason blended into the flow as he always did. The clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes roaming with outward indifference and inward calculation. He adjusted his ID badge, letting it sit where it could be seen easily. That badge bought him passage into spaces no one questioned, but no one cared about either. He approached the communications wing, a narrow hall branching from the main corridor. The hum of servers grew louder, vibrating faintly through the floor. At the end of the hall, 2 Marines in desert tans stood guard at the secure comm room. Both young, both tired, their boots planted wide like they'd been standing there since their ancestors first touched dry land. One of them nodded as Mason approached. "Morning, sir." Mason returned the nod. "Morning." He didn't know their names, but he recognized the weary alertness in their eyes. The elder-looking one, with a broad jaw dusted in faint stubble, seemed the more at ease. His name tape read Rook. "Everything quiet?" Mason asked casually. Rook shrugged. "Quiet enough to make me paranoid." His partner, private first class, barely 20, a wiry kid with freckles and restless hands, snorted a laugh. "He says that every shift." "That's because it's true," Rook replied, tapping a knuckle against the wall as if checking for echoes. Too quiet is where trouble lives. Mason held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. These weren't men involved in covert activity. They were watchers, not players. But watchers notice things. "Let me know if quiet turns into something else," Mason said. Rook raised an eyebrow. "Planning on being around a while?" "I'm everywhere," Mason said lightly, "like mold." The younger Marine laughed, and Rook cracked a smile before returning to his post. Mason walked on. The door to the auxiliary storage office was closed when he arrived. Nothing unusual in that, except the tiny flicker of movement he thought he'd seen in the gap at the bottom of the frame. A shadow shifting, a hesitation. He waited 3 seconds, not long enough to be suspicious, not short enough to be impulsive. Then he knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again. A soft voice finally whispered, "Just a second." The door opened a crack. Standing inside was Evan Brooks, the base logistics clerk, a man in his early 40s with an oddly delicate build, pale skin, and narrow shoulders hunched toward his chest as if apologizing for occupying space. His thinning sandy hair fell over his forehead in uneven strands, and his wire-frame glasses, slightly bent at the hinges, sat crooked on his nose. Behind those lenses, his gray eyes darted like skittish birds. "Oh," he said, sounding surprised but not displeased. "You're the safety guy." "Mason," Mason said. "Yes, Mason." Brooks smiled, but it trembled. "Sorry, I wasn't expecting anyone yet. It's, early. Early is when safety thrives." Brooks gave a weak laugh. "I suppose so." Mason stepped inside. The room was cramped, filled with supply binders, outdated forms, spare cables, and a coffee maker that looked like it ran on hope rather than electricity. But what caught Mason's eye was a second coffee cup on the table, half full, still steaming. Brooks noticed Mason looking. The night shift tech was in here earlier, left their cup behind. "Night shift tech," Mason repeated. "Who?" "Oh, just someone covering the midnight maintenance sweep," Brooks said too quickly. "Nothing unusual?" "Nothing unusual" was a sentence that almost always meant something was. Mason walked toward a stack of old routers on the shelf. "Mind if I check the inventory logs? Trying to reconcile what equipment gets borrowed after hours." Brooks swallowed, hard. "Sure, yes. Let me pull them up." He moved to his computer, fingers shaking slightly as he logged in. The tremor wasn't caffeine. It was fear. Exhaustion lived around his eyes, shadows deepened by sleepless nights, unresolved tension, or secrets that pressed too heavily on a thin frame. He pulled up a spreadsheet. Here, everything's accounted for since last quarter. Mason leaned in. Mind scrolling to the last 24 hours? Brooks hesitated, a pause so subtle another man might have missed it. Mason didn't. Then Brooks forced a shaky chuckle and scrolled. The entries looked clean, too clean. The logs were perfect to the point of falseness. No minor errors, no typos, no casual shorthand, nothing human, like someone had rewritten them. Mason filed the observation away. He turned to leave. Before he reached the door, Brooks whispered, "Do you ever feel like something is watching you in this place?" Mason looked back. Brooks's face had paled. He pressed a palm to the center of his chest as if his heart beat too fast. Like the walls are listening," Brooks whispered. Mason didn't lie. Yes, sometimes. Brooks nodded quickly, almost gratefully, then shut his computer with a trembling hand. As Mason stepped into the hallway again, the door clicked shut behind him. 2 seconds later, tap, 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 soft knuckles on the door, coming from inside the office. But Brooks wasn't calling for anyone. It was the wrong sound, too light, too deliberate. Mason froze. A shadow passed under the crack of the door, then vanished. He waited, breath held, instincts coiling. But no voice followed, no footsteps, nothing. Just the fading echo of 3 small knocks that did not belong to Evan Brooks. Someone else had been in that room, or still was, watching, listening, hiding. Mason left the hall in silence, mind already shifting strategies. The mole's network was broader than he thought. Elena Graves with her USB drives, Brooks with his trembling lies, the unknown silhouette in the fog, now the tap on the door. Too many threads. But they were beginning to weave. He headed toward the open-air walkway that overlooked the ocean. Morning light had begun to break across the horizon, turning the fog into gold and steel and shadow. Gulls wheeled overhead, a flash of white wings cutting through the cold. He rested both hands on the railing. He needed clarity, patterns, predictable behaviors. A voice startled him from behind. "Trouble finding what you're looking for?" He turned. Captain Laura Kincaid stood 10 feet away. Tall, broad-shouldered. A woman in her mid-40s with coffee-dark skin, her hair in tight curls pulled into a low bun. Her presence radiated command, steady, uncompromising, and sharpened by decades of dealing with both officers and crises. Her uniform was immaculate, but her eyes carried the faint heaviness of someone who'd slept less than she pretended. She was the head of operations. He had seen her from afar, but never this close. And she was studying him. "What makes you think I'm looking for something?" Mason replied. Kincaid crossed her arms, her sleeves strained slightly over muscular forearms. "Contractors don't walk the base at dawn unless they're ambitious or lost. Or awake," Mason said. She huffed. "If you say so. You were talking with Brooks? Poor man looks ready to vibrate apart. You spook him?" "Not intentionally." Kincaid stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Keep whatever you're doing inside the lines. The colonel is prickly enough lately. Don't give him excuses." "Wouldn't dream of it." She eyed him, long and analytical. The kind of look that could peel off layers if held long enough. Then she nodded once and walked away, boots thudding against the walkway. Mason exhaled slowly. If Kincaid had noticed him, others would soon. He returned to his room. opened his encrypted laptop, pulled up Elena's logs again, then Brooks's, then cross-referenced both with the anomalies. A pattern emerged. Whoever was leaking data wasn't working from a single terminal or method. They moved, shifted, hid, but their signature, a distinct timing pattern, kept repeating. He leaned back, closing his eyes. Timing was everything, and someone in this base was counting on no one noticing. Mason would. He opened his eyes again. He typed, "Begin deeper trace. Target cluster H9. The hunt sharpened, and someone out there, someone who tapped lightly on locked doors, knew he was getting closer. Mason Cole spent the next hour inside his room cross-checking logs, but the inconsistencies only multiplied. The more he pressed on the anomaly in cluster H9, the more the data folded in on itself. Too perfect in places, strangely incomplete in others, as if someone had hand-stitched fragments of truth into a quilt of lies. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaled, and closed the laptop. This mole wasn't sloppy. They were meticulous. The room felt too still, too controlled. The radiator hummed softly, but the air tasted of metal and night air seeping in from the poorly sealed window frame. He needed ground truth, something independent of the logs, something physical. He stepped outside. The walkways were busier now. Forklifts hummed in the distance. Crews tightened bolts on radar equipment. Sailors exchanged clipboards, muttering about deadlines. Ordinary life returning to the base, ordinary on the surface, deceptive underneath. Mason headed toward the mid-level admin building. If Brooks' logs had been scrubbed, he needed evidence untouched by trembling hands. He reached the stairs just as a woman rounded the landing above him, arms filled with cartons of supply documents. She nearly collided with him. "Oh, sorry," she gasped. Mason steadied one of the boxes before it tipped. "No harm done?" She exhaled with obvious relief. Her name tag read, Teresa Caldwell, Admin Specialist. Teresa looked around 30, short, slightly round in the cheeks, her light brown hair pulled back into a loose bun with strands escaping like they were tired of discipline. Her warm hazel eyes flicked with quick intelligence, though her posture carried a gentle nervousness, as if life had taught her not to take up too much space. Her uniform, a simple admin khaki, was clean but worn, sleeves rolled haphazardly, a streak of pen ink on one cuff. "Morning," she said, shifting boxes in her grip. "If these files spill, I may just pretend to faint." "Need a hand?" Mason asked. Teresa blinked, surprised by the offer. "Really? Most contractors pretend I don't exist until they need printer codes." "I'm not most contractors." She smiled timidly. "Then yes, please." They carried the boxes together into the admin records room. A cramped maze of cabinets, towering stacks of binders, and a single flickering ceiling light that buzzed like a trapped wasp. Teresa set the boxes down on a metal desk and rubbed her wrists. "I swear these files reproduce at night. I left 5 boxes, came back to 8. "You manage all this alone?" Mason asked. "Oh no, there's 3 of us." She pointed to 2 empty desks. "They're both out sick today. Something going around." Her tone suggested she didn't fully believe that. Mason scanned the room. Paper, ink, stale air, old files stored here. Files a mole would be careful not to touch. Too traceable. Teresa caught him looking. "If you're searching for something specific, I can help. I know this room better than my own apartment." "I'm checking equipment requisitions," Mason said. "Last 2 months." "Oh." Her face lit with purpose. She dug through a drawer, pulled out a thick binder. "Here, everything's signed and logged." He flipped through it slowly. Unlike Brooks' logs, These had human errors, crossed-out entries, initials scribbled sideways, coffee stains, the truth of real paperwork. But halfway through, something shifted. Entries from 2 weeks ago suddenly became pristine. Printed pages inserted into the handwritten record, numbers aligned too perfectly, no mistakes, no smudges. Teresa frowned. "That's odd. I didn't print these. We keep manual logs here." "When were these added?" Mason asked. "I don't know. They weren't here last week." She pointed at a corner. "We had a power outage Friday night. Maybe someone refiled things afterward? Or replaced them?" Her brows knit. Why would anyone replace requisition logs? Mason didn't answer. She swallowed. "Is something wrong?" Before he could respond, a quiet buzz vibrated against her desk. Her phone. She checked the screen, her face drained of color. "Excuse me," she whispered. She hurried toward the hallway with an anxiety too sharp to be from a simple message. Something was wrong with her, too. Something she wasn't saying. When Teresa left, Mason examined the pristine pages again. At the bottom of one was a signature line. No name, just a password. A single phrase typed in small, cold letters. Rivergate 17. Mason's blood chilled. That phrase should not exist. It belonged to a classified emergency channel used only by the Inspector General's internal task force. Buried deep, rotated often, accessible to fewer than 30 people nationwide. No one on this base should know it. No one should print it. No one should even be able to see it. Someone wasn't just leaking data. Someone had tapped into the Inspector General's private layer, his layer. The mole wasn't running from the government. They were inside it. He closed the binder, breath steady but sharp. He scanned the cabinet shelf. A single drawer, equipment archives, temp storage, was slightly ajar. Not enough to catch most eyes, but enough to catch his. He pulled it open. Inside, tucked between folders, was a crumpled form with an access timestamp. Mason opened it carefully. The timestamp aligned exactly with the hour Elena Graves was in the server room. The same exact minute. Someone had used the maintenance wing as a transfer point. And Elena was either a messenger or a distraction. He needed to confront her, but not yet. Not without proof she couldn't wriggle out of. Voices approached from the hall. Mason slipped the form into his clipboard and stepped back just as Teresa returned. Eyes red, hands trembling slightly. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded too quickly. "Just bad news, family stuff, nothing to worry about." A lie thin as paper. She avoided his eyes. "Did you find what you needed?" "More than I expected," he said. Her gaze flicked to his clipboard, curiosity mixed with fear. If you need anything else, just ask." "I will." He left the room, closing the door behind him. The hallway stretched long and quiet. Mason walked with slow, deliberate steps. Each new piece tightened the web. Elena in the server wing. Brooks trembling behind a lie. The unknown figure in the fog. Now Teresa reacting as if hunted. And the password, his password, buried in falsified records. He reached the exit door leading to the breezeway. Cold ocean air rushed into his lungs as he stepped outside. He leaned against a pillar, staring out at the gray sea. Someone out there, someone with access to his world, was threading inside the base like a ghost. Someone who knew how to erase, replace, infiltrate. He closed his eyes, listened, counted softly. 1, 2, 3, 4. When he opened them, clarity struck with brutal precision. This wasn't just a mole. It was a network. And the network knew about him. The wind had shifted by midday, flowing in from the ocean with a salty sharpness that scraped along the concrete structures of the base. It carried a heaviness that Mason Cole recognized. Not weather, but atmosphere. A building tension. The kind that settled into the metal bones of a place when too many lies were moving beneath the surface. He kept to the outer ring of the installation as he walked, clipboard tucked against his ribs. Out here, the midday sun sliced the fog apart in slow, lazy strips, letting patches of blue sky show through like torn paper. Sailors performed drills on the far pads. Engineers in hard hats tested radar angles, a base pretending to be normal. But the false requisition logs, the classified password, the trembling hands of Evan Brooks, and the strange panic in Teresa Caldwell's eyes proved otherwise. Someone was escalating. Someone wanted him off balance. Mason pushed open the heavy metal door of the West Maintenance Tunnel. The tunnel stretched beneath several buildings, dark, cool, and loud, with the rumble of pipes carrying heat and water. It was a perfect place to hide physical evidence, which was why he needed to search it. His boots echoed. His breath fogged in the chilled air. Halfway down the tunnel, he saw movement. A man knelt beside an electrical junction panel, tools spread neatly on a mat. He wore gray coveralls, sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms tattooed with faded ink. Old military symbols repurposed into abstract lines. His hair was a shaggy brown, streaked with early gray, pulled into a short tail. A short beard sharpened the angles of his jaw. His build was thick, powerful, the kind forged by manual labor rather than gym routines. When the man turned, Mason noted his eyes first. Dark green, piercing, alert, too alert. His name tape read, J. Murphy, Infrastructure Tech. Morning, the man said, voice gravelly but friendly. If you're here to tell me this tunnel violates a safety code, just go ahead and break my spirit now. Mason allowed a faint smile. Not unless you're hiding explosives in that panel. Nah, Murphy chuckled. Those are in the next tunnel. He laughed at his own joke. A dry, unhurried laugh of someone who didn't mind being misunderstood. Not a social climber, not a nervous liar. But something else flickered in his posture. A quiet watchfulness. A man who had lived outside the law at least once. What brings you down here? Murphy asked, wiping sweat from his brow with a mechanic's rag. His hands were calloused, scarred, practical. Hands that had broken and mended more than machines. Not many desk guys come this far unless someone yelled at them. Routine check, Mason said. Doors, vents, panic lights. Uh-huh, Murphy replied, studying him with a tilt of the head. You walk like someone who still counts exits, even in your sleep. You watch people closely, Mason observed. Murphy smirked. It's a hobby. Helps me survive bad supervisors and worse marriages. The man was too perceptive to dismiss, too aware of his surroundings, too practiced at hiding intelligence behind humor, a useful person or a dangerous one. Mason moved on, but didn't miss the way Murphy subtly checked the overhead camera, just a simple glance, and then shifted his body half an inch into the camera's known blind spot. Not many people knew that blind spot existed. Mason filed the detail away. As he reached the end of the tunnel, a maintenance access door stood half open. Cold air seeped through the crack. Someone had passed through recently. He pushed the door fully open and stepped into a small, dim storage cubicle. Shelves lined the walls with spare filters, broken clamps, old wiring coils. Nothing looked out of place until he noticed a small metallic box tucked behind a stack of filters. A portable hard drive. Unlabeled, government grade. He reached for it. a sudden whir of static burst from the wall intercom, loud enough to make him tense. Then, without warning, the security monitor flickered to life on the shelf above. A video feed from an Overwatch camera. But the camera was pointed at one of the outer walkways. And in the grainy footage, a figure stood perfectly still in the fog. Just like the silhouette Mason had seen 2 nights earlier. Tall, broad, unmoving, facing the building, watching him. This time the figure turned its head slightly, as if sensing the camera. A smile curved across the shadowed face. Slow, deliberate. A smile that told Mason one unmistakable truth. They knew exactly how close he was getting. The feed cut to black. The intercom fell silent. Mason's breath remained steady, but a cold pulse pressed against his throat. He took the hard drive, slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and backed out of the room. The tunnel felt narrower on the way back, pipes groaning like something alive. As he approached the main ladder exit, he saw Murphy again. But this time, the man wasn't tinkering. He was standing, waiting. Murphy scratched his beard. "You look like you found something you wish you hadn't." "What makes you say that?" "You're walking stiff," Murphy said, "like someone who just pocketed a secret." His eyes softened, not mocking, but oddly understanding. "I've carried a few of those," Murphy added. "Never ends well." He lifted his tools and slung the roll over his shoulder. "Be careful, Inspector. This place eats the wrong people alive." Mason stiffened. "What did you call me?" Murphy paused, smile tilted sideways. "Relax. I'm not clairvoyant. You look like a guy who inspects things. Could be pipes, could be sins. Doesn't matter to me." Then he walked past, boots grinding against concrete, leaving Mason in the swirl of tunnel air and new suspicions. Outside, sunlight had brightened the coastline, but the wind still bit cold. He made his way back, toward the contractor housing, blending into the foot traffic. Elena Graves passed by at a distance, clutching her tablet tight, too tight. Teresa hurried across the quad, eyes red, jaw clenched. Evan Brooks stumbled out of admin, dropping a stack of forms, threads tightening, the network closing, and the smile he saw on the camera replayed in his mind like a ghost. He reached his room, locked the door, and opened the hard drive. Encrypted, deeply. But the structure was familiar, almost mocking. Someone had used Inspector General encryption patterns, altered but recognizable. He typed the first bypass key. A single folder appeared, PLF, a name he knew. A code name used years ago in an internal investigation that had never made the news. A case involving double agents, shadow accounts, and a leak that nearly toppled a marine intelligence operation overseas. That case had ended with several arrests. But one name, one handler, had never been identified. Someone was resurrecting the blueprint of a ghost. Mason sat back, jaw clenched. The network wasn't random. It wasn't messy. It wasn't even focused on simple data theft. It was rebuilding something broken long ago. Something that had once nearly destroyed men just like him. The wind rattled the window frame. He typed the second bypass key. The folder began to open. The folder opened with a quiet, almost polite flicker, as if whatever waited inside was holding its breath along with him. Mason Cole sat on the narrow chair in his contractor room, the hard drive balanced beside his laptop, the cursor blinking over the directory labeled PLF. Outside, the wind pressed against the thin window, carrying the low hum of base life and the distant crash of the Pacific. Inside the room, there was only his breathing. Measured, steady, that old 4-count rhythm trying to pin the present down before the past tore it open. The screen populated with files. Not many, just enough to feel deliberate. 4 primary documents, time-stamped across the last 6 months, plus 1 unlabeled video file with a creation date that didn't match the sequence. The metadata had been scrubbed clumsily in some places, elegantly in others. That mismatch alone told him what kind of mind he was dealing with. Careful, but prideful. Someone who thought they were smarter than the system. And for a long time, they had been. He opened the first document, operational summaries, short, clinical descriptions of asset movement and tactically advantageous disclosures tied to innocuous contract numbers that he recognized as fronts for private military firms. Each report referenced HZAN with an attached numerical code, handler designations. At the bottom of the third page, buried in dry text, the letters finally appeared unmasked. Handler 0, primary architect. The words sat on the screen like a bruise he'd forgotten about until someone pressed on it. Handler 0, internal folklore inside the Inspector General's office. The ghost at the heart of a past investigation that had led nowhere and left too many bodies behind. A handler whose operations had threaded through classified corridors without ever leaving a visible fingerprint. Someone who could turn loyal officers into silent collaborators. Someone who had almost broken Mason's old world once already. He opened the second document. This one was a tree, a network diagram. Lines connected names, code numbers, facility tags. Some were familiar. Contractors, officers, civilian liaisons spread across multiple bases. Others were blacked out or replaced with symbols only someone from his side would recognize. Internal markers for suspected but unconfirmed, for compromised oversight, for cannot be trusted. At the nexus of several thick lines sat a single node. No name, no photo. Just a stylized mark, a circle split by a jagged vertical line. Handler 0's emblem. Mason stared at it. In an old interrogation room years ago, a frightened lieutenant had drawn that same symbol on the table with a shaking finger before shutting down completely. No amount of questioning had opened him again. That symbol, that fracture mark, had haunted a dozen redacted reports. Now it was here, on this base, in his hands. He opened the video file. For a second, the screen stayed, black, then static. Then an image resolved. Grainy, poorly lit, clearly taken from a concealed camera. The angle looked up from almost floor level toward a table in a bland office. A man sat there, backlit by a desk lamp. No visible rank, no nameplate. Just a plain dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms. His hands were large, veins prominent, knuckles scarred. The hands of someone who had once known field work, but now dealt more in signatures and phone calls. His hair was dark, threaded with gray at the temples, short but not regulation. A shadow of controlled stubble lined his jaw. The camera caught only part of his face, but it was enough. High cheekbones, straight nose, eyes a cool, pale gray that barely moved while he spoke. His voice filled the tiny room with a calm that made Mason's skin crawl. "We move when the Inspector General assigns their own bloodhound," the man said. "That's the pattern. They can't leave a wound alone. When one of them appears, we use them. Draw their attention away, let them tear down the front man while we move assets behind them." He leaned forward, and for a fraction of a second, his full face entered the frame. Mason froze. He didn't recognize the man personally, but he recognized the expression. A distant, clinical detachment that he had seen before in the briefing photo of the unnamed coordinator behind the convoy reroute that had gotten his squad killed. The resolution had been bad, the angle wrong, but the feeling was the same. The man on screen continued. "They lost a Marine captain in the last run. Cole, good instincts, dangerous mind. If he resurfaces on our radar in any capacity, we either redirect him or we bury him in noise. The video timestamp was from more than a year ago, before anyone had ever told Mason this current assignment existed. He was never just investigating them. He had been part of their playbook before he even stepped onto this base. The laptop speakers crackled once and cut off. The video ended. He sat still, the room suddenly too small. Somewhere in his chest, the old convoy explosion replayed, not as a sound, but as a sensation, the hollow shock of force and heat. He forced his jaw to unclench. He needed air. He closed the laptop, pocketed the hard drive, and left the room. The corridor outside buzzed faintly, lights humming overhead, the base operating in its daytime rhythm. He moved down the stairs toward the central concourse. Conversations overlapped in the distance. Voices, laughter, the clink of metal trays from the mess. Normalcy was a costume the base wore well. He was halfway across the concourse when the world shifted. The lights blinked once, then darkness swallowed the hallway whole. Power outage. An emergency generator should have kicked in within seconds. But the silence stretched longer than it should have, a void thick with held breath. Somewhere, someone cursed. A door banged. Footsteps quickened. Then the red emergency strips along. The floor flickered to life, washing the corridor in a low, bloody glow. The air vents still hummed. That meant power wasn't entirely gone. Just redirected. A targeted blackout. And in the distance, an alarm began to pulse softly. A warning tone, not yet full-blown panic. Mason didn't move at first. He let his eyes adjust, breathing slow. Blackouts could be accidents, but not when they aligned with new discoveries. Not when PLF still sat warm on the hard drive in his pocket. He heard boots behind him. 2 sets, heavy, fast. He turned casually, as if just another confused contractor caught in a glitch. 2 security personnel came into view from the cross corridor. They wore standard base security uniforms, but there was something off about them. Both were tall, both built solid, the kind of thick muscle that came from actual training instead of gym mirrors. The older one had a shaved head, a square jaw, and a faint white scar running from the corner of his lip to his chin, like someone had once tried to cut the truth out of him. His eyes were a flat, attentive brown. The younger one had close-cropped blonde hair, a clean-shaven face, and cheekbones too sharp to match the blankness he tried to hold there. "Hey," the older one called. "Contractors are supposed to muster at the south lot during power disruptions." Mason nodded once. "First I've heard of it." "New protocol," the younger one said. His voice carried a little too much eagerness. "We'll escort you." The older one's gaze slid briefly to Mason's chest, where his badge hung. Too brief for someone checking credentials. Long enough to confirm a target. Every instinct Mason had honed through years of patrols, ambushes, and investigations flared at once. "Appreciate it," he said mildly. "Let me grab my bag from my room, and I'll head that way." "Negative," the older guard replied. "All movement is controlled during an outage. You'll come with us now." There it was, the tightening of invisible fingers. Mason did a quick map in his head. 3 exits within sprint distance. 2 cameras in this hall that might still be on backup power. 1 blind spot near the junction with the maintenance stairwell. He smiled faintly. "I get twitchy in the dark," he said. "Mind if I walk in front? Easier to pretend nobody's behind me." The younger guard snorted. "Sure, whatever." "Keep your hands visible," the older one added. Mason turned toward the direction they indicated, walked, counted his steps, noted the way their footfalls echoed a fraction of a second after his. Both too close, too ready. They reached the junction. The turn toward the so-called south lot was to the right. The maintenance stairwell was to the left. Mason pivoted right with his body and cut left with his momentum. His shoulder hit the crash bar on the stairwell door. It flew open. He slipped through and jolted down 2 steps as a shout snapped behind him. "Stop!" A hand grabbed for his collar. He ducked, twisted, felt fingers scrape his neck instead of closing. The stairwell spun in red emergency light, the sound of boots pounding above. He moved fast, but not recklessly, feet finding each step by memory more than sight. This stairwell led toward the lower service corridor, another maintenance artery like the one where he'd met Murphy. "Murphy!" Voices echoed from above. "Cut him off from the bottom." They had planned this then, knew the routes, knew his likely escape paths. He hit the landing. A figure stepped out of the lower doorway so suddenly that Mason's hand went to where a sidearm would have been in another life. "Easy," the figure said calmly. Murphy. Same gray coveralls, same broad-shouldered frame, and green eyes catching the red light like a cat's. In one hand, he held a heavy wrench. In the other, a small, flat device that looked like a remote. "You picked a bad time for cardio, Inspector," Murphy murmured. "Company's coming." "To security," Mason said between breaths. "Not standard." "Yeah, I've seen their type," Murphy replied. "The kind that shows up 2 weeks before a system upgrade and leaves right after files go missing." He jerked his chin toward the side passage. "This way." Mason hesitated. "Why help me?" Murphy's mouth curled into a wry, tired smile. "Because I don't like men who smile at cameras in the dark." Before Mason could respond, Murphy thumbed the remote. Somewhere above, a loud mechanical clank echoed, like a gate sliding into place. The footsteps from the stairwell suddenly stopped, followed by muffled swearing. "Emergency fire door," Murphy said. "Old system. Still does what it's supposed to if you know where it's wired." He led Mason through a low maintenance crawl, ducking under pipes, moving with the ease of someone who had mapped every artery of the base from the inside out. They emerged into a side utility room lit by a single flickering bulb. Murphy leaned against a support beam, studying Mason's face. Up close, the lines around his eyes told more stories than his words ever would. "You're not just here for fire codes," he said. "And whatever you found on that drive has the wrong kind of people nervous." Mason met his gaze. "You know more than you say." "I know enough to recognize a hunt when I see one," Murphy replied. Then quieter, "And I know your name from before." The words landed like a small explosion in the cramped room. "Before when?" Mason asked, voice low. Murphy looked away, jaw tightening, eyes fixed on some memory only he could see. "Afghanistan. Years back. Heard about a Marine captain whose convoy got ghosted because someone higher up changed the route on a new intel pretext. Word was the captain lived. Word was he didn't stop asking questions." He looked back. "Cole, right?" Mason didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The silence was confirmation. Murphy exhaled. "Guys like you either die early or you end up here, chasing the same shadow with different names." Somewhere, a distant klaxon blared twice and then stopped, the system testing itself. Power would come back soon. The window for honest mistakes was closing. Mason pulled the hard drive from his pocket. "You said you've carried secrets before. Have you seen this pattern?" Murphy studied the device, brow furrowing. "Can't see inside it, can I? But I've seen the results. Trucks that never make it to their destination. ops that fail just late enough to look like bad luck. Mason nodded slowly. He knew that rhythm all too well. Later, when he finally got back to his room and reopened his laptop under the returning white lights, he ran a deeper scan on the audio metadata from the video file. A codec signature floated in the raw data, tiny, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. He cross-referenced it with archived fragments from his old case files, the ones he had salvaged before they were sealed. The pattern matched, byte for byte. The same codec that had been embedded in the fraudulent root update that sent his convoy into a kill zone now sat inside this new video, stamped across Handler Zero's voice. Whoever was running this network hadn't just learned from the past. They were reusing it. The ambush that killed his team hadn't been an isolated betrayal. It had been the prototype. And now, the prototype was back. Sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought on open fields or distant shores. They unfold quietly inside the human heart, in the choices we make when no one is watching, and in the courage to keep going when everything feels lost. And in those moments, when the world grows heavy and the path ahead feels uncertain, grace often arrives in ways we never expect. A whisper of strength, a door opening at the right moment, a reminder that we are not walking alone. Maybe that is the real miracle, how light finds us even in the places we thought were forgotten. How God reaches into ordinary days and turns them into something meaningful. And how each of us, no matter our wounds or failures, can rise again with purpose. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope still lives in quiet corners. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Until then, may God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring peace to your home and your heart.